Hello there, good afternoon from London, and hello to everyone that's joining us from around the world. Hi again to all our zoomed in viewers, but also those joining us from the London Festival of Architecture and elsewhere. It's great to see you here, and today we're very lucky to be joined by some of the leaders in their fields working in public policy and urban resilience, and we're presenting to you today a talk, Facing the Unknown, about how public policy is going to shape the international built environment response to the pandemic that we're facing at the moment. So this is something that I've curated alongside friend and collaborator Francisco Ibanez, ahead of an exhibition that we've been doing for the physical London Festival of Architecture programme. Francisco, do you want to say hi and talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so hi, Lux. So this discussion panel called Facing the Unknown, as Luke mentioned, is part of a series of activities related to a photography exhibition we're organizing, which will be called Power Structures. The exhibition will have internationally renowned photographers and will explore the impact that socioeconomic power dynamics have over the built environment. This panel, Facing the Unknown, the guests will be discussing around the question, how is coronavirus going to affect and reshape the cities we live in? The panel will be chaired by Emma Peters. Emma is an experienced urban planner with extensive experience in housing and urban regeneration. She currently works as a senior advisor for local government and regional government, and she's the director of Inner Circle Consulting. Also, she's a regular speaker on housing and regeneration conferences. I have been lucky enough to work with Emma, and I have the biggest admiration for her. We will leave Emma to introduce the other panelists. With Luke, we're going out of the call now, and we'll come back in 45 minutes to make questions from the public. So we encourage you to leave any comments, and we'll be selecting the questions. Emma?
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you, Luke. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon, this evening on this call. We've got a great lineup of panelists here, and I'm very pleased to introduce, first of all, Professor Andrés Velasco. Andrés is a renowned Chilean economist, academic, and a politician. He served as the finance minister of Chile from March 2006 until March 2010, which was the whole of the first presidential term of Michelle Bachelet. Andrés is currently the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Leanne Hartley is the co-founder of MEND, which is a social sustainability consultancy which specialises in responsible procurement, planning and placemaking. She's also the founder of Urbanistas, which is a collaborative women-led network which is amplifying women's voices and ideas to make cities better for everyone. Leanne is also a member of the Mayor of London's Infrastructure Advisory Panel. And finally, Elena Montero. Elena has extensive experience with local and regional governments and a track record in promoting international cooperation between cities. Elena was the Associate Director of 100 Resilient Cities programme and worked very closely with different Latin American cities at that time. Prior to that, she ran the Office for Foreign Affairs for the Sao Paulo state government in Brazil. And Elena, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. Really, the theme running through what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is resilience, and the resilience of cities, and how, with the coronavirus pandemic, what both the threat is and also what the opportunity is. And I wonder if you could start us off, please, by explaining what the 100 Resilient Cities programme meant by resilience.
All right. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Francisco and the London Architecture Festival for this invitation. Happy World Environment Day for everyone. I think it's a very a good opportunity to talk about resilience and climate and COVID and how we're going to live through it. It's a pleasure to be here. So the program 100 Resilient Cities define urban resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within the city to survive, to adapt, grow, no matter what the acute shocks or chronic stresses that they experience. And it's interesting because when we started working with cities and in my working with Latin America, it was very easy for the cities to identify their shocks, which is like an earthquake in Mexico City or a big flood in Santa Fe in Argentina, or landslides in Salvador. But as we go through developing the resilience strategy, we would notice that the chronic stresses, such as the lack of infrastructure, the unemployment, the social inequity or youth disenfranchisement, that would be the ones, the real challenges undermining the health of the city. So then when a shock, when a disaster comes, the city is not in a good shape, in a good health to go through these disasters. And the way I see COVID-19, trying to get into our main focus here is, it is a big shock. It is like a tsunami almost that is hitting our cities. And as we need to work on this, we are starting to realize that it's actually going to be a chronic stress, something that cities will have to live with for a long time. So we're not talking about what cities will look like post-COVID-19. It's like how cities are going to look through COVID-19. So I guess this is more or less how we would see city or urban resilience.
And Andrés, if I can come to you, I think it's not just a global pandemic, is it? It's not just a public health crisis. It's also a major economic crisis, and that carries its own challenges and potentially its own opportunities. Can you tell us a bit about your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. You've said it well. This is going to be arguably the biggest economic crisis the world has lived through in the last century. And it is not difficult to put down scenarios which make it as bad or worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. And if this is true in the rich countries like the US or the UK or most European countries, it is even more true of developing countries. Elena's from Brazil, I'm from Chile. I've been looking at numbers of what might happen to employment, to economic activity in Latin America and parts of Asia and parts of Africa. And it is quite clear that the numbers are going to be worse. Now, for governments, the first priority, of course, has to be to contain contagion and to help families in need. And across the world, of course, the starting point is more difficult. In a country like the UK, most people have a formal employment so that the government can furlough people and they keep getting a paycheck, or they have some sort of unemployment insurance in the US. In many places in the developing world, there's no such thing because people work informally. They work without a contract, and therefore there's no pre-specified wage that someone, the government or an insurance company can keep paying. And as a result, the hardship and the loss of employment will add to the loss of life to make this a very, very big crisis. Now, there's an old cliche that says that a crisis is an opportunity that should not go to waste. And clearly, I think in this crisis, there are opportunities because they will give us a chance to reassess what it is that we've been doing wrong. And if the focus of our conversation here is resilience, and one simple way to define that concept is to say, how good are we at dealing with shocks, dealing with the unknown? I think it's pretty clear that in many dimensions, the world today is unprepared to deal with shocks. We're unprepared to deal with the big shock that we know is coming. It's called global warming. We're unprepared to deal with another big shock, which is maybe not so clearly evident here in the UK, which is a wet and rainy place, but in much of the world, water is increasingly scarce. And that is a shock that we know is coming. And needless to say, this is not the first pandemic we've had in the last 2 decades. In fact, it's the 4th or 5th. And as a result, we will need to be thinking much more carefully about how we build spare capacities in hospitals, how we build spare capacities in public finances to have the cash available to jump in and spend what you have to spend. But, and I will end my answer here, this is also an opportunity for rebuilding. This will be an opportunity for injecting public funds into investment programs to have jobs once we can all go back into the streets and go back to work. And as a result, there's a very strong case to be made that that investment cannot be like any old investment. There are big challenges all over the place to invest more in green infrastructure, in cleaner power, in better supplies of potable water in the developing world. And what we do in the next 5 or 10 years in terms of green investment will pretty much decide the fate of the planet when it comes to global warming over the last 50 or 60, the next 50 or 60 years. So it is really up to us. It will not be easy because we will have a recession, many people will be out of work, and there will be pressures to go for, you know, economic growth at any price. But I would like to think that is a tension we can resolve. We can have more growth once the pandemic begins to recede, but it could be a good kind of growth, one that is based on green investment.
And Leanne, I know you've done a lot of work on social value and different ways of measuring, both measuring social value, but also promoting social value in making decision making around city environments. What do you think are the opportunities and the dangers? Do you think that cities are going to prioritise jobs at the expense of all else, or can we get social value, environmental policy, sustainability back up the agenda, and how do we do that?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's great. And in fact, coming off the back of Andrés just now, I echo the sentiment about the need for this to be an opportunity to reevaluate and reconfigure our outlook and approach to how we design, deliver, and produce urban space. And just to answer your question, I think it could be easy to do that for obvious reasons. And as Andrés has pointed out, just the sheer weight of potentially negative economic impacts that arising from the pandemic would easily lend us to set aside very hard-won goals in terms of elevating the need for environmental well-being and social aspects to be part of the criteria for making decisions on how we design, develop and produce urban space. But I wanted to draw attention to the trends that have certainly been apparent even in the last decade. And that is that social value, far from being a fringe issue, is now front and centre. And I point to examples like the Olympics, and following hotly on the heels of the Olympics Crossrail, and following hotly on the heels of that, Tideway. And those are just 3 examples in London of major, massive pieces of kit, shall we say, where social value and responsible procurement, ethical sourcing, these key tenets of social value were absolutely fundamental to the delivery. And I have to say that each time a new iteration came in, there was improvement. And just to sort of emphasize that, the Tideway project at the time in 2017, when it issued the opportunity for investing in green bonds, raised the biggest amount of investment of any green bond ever. The interest in it was huge and beyond expectation. And I understand that future investment approaches and models will follow this example. Now, I don't see necessarily how that trend needs to change. I think in actual fact, it needs to set a template for the future. It isn't incompatible with growth. It's actually about better growth and different growth. And I think that has to be the way we look at it. I think in terms of looking more locally, for the past 10 years, I've been arguing for an approach that looks at building community resilience, community confidence, and about active citizenship. And I think this crisis, more than anything, has just demonstrated beyond recognition how much active citizenship there is embedded in our communities. And that has been an incredible positive out of this awful crisis, is seeing just how quickly and effortlessly and efficiently and effectively ordinary people like us living in our communities can mobilize incredible responses. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. And I like to think that, of course, when the pandemic and the virus, the immediate danger passes, that elements of that won't wash out back to sea, that parts of that will be left on the shore, if you like, and that we have that to build on. So for me, it's about actually what role do you want our communities to play in this process, in this recovery? And actually, people might have heard me say this before, but I think it's about seeing the community as more of a client. Actually, do we need communities to be actually commissioning and making core decisions as a client rather than a recipient or a bystander of change? So I'd like to see those sort of those kind of ideas and momentums taking more of a central role.
And Elena, in some of the work that you've done through the 100 Cities programme, working locally and in Sao Paulo and places, what experience have you had? What helps communities to actually get involved and then maintain that, I suppose, that level of commitment and the ability to influence their places? What makes a difference in that?
I agree with Leanne on the role of the community and bringing this to a community in informal settlements in Latin America, for instance. These are the ones who are like hit the hardest, right? But they are also very good in like creating this network of information and trained people that are the family doctors that are the ones collecting data on informal settlements, and we should use and go to this really localized networks to find the solution. And I agree as well that we should not be reinventing the wheel. Cities have been working in climate plans, in resiliency strategies. There is a lot of like intentionality on what is being doing into like green investment. And I do understand that there will be a lack of funding, but at the same time, I see, for instance, the World Bank has recently announced $160 billion for line of credit for disaster risk reduction focus on COVID. And this is something that gives liquidity to governments to just tackle immediate response. But I think that in terms of how cities can better respond to this, I like to bring the idea of trust. And one is trusting your neighbor and knowing your neighbor's telephone and knowing that you can leave your child with your neighbor and having this sense of community. This is very, very important, but also trust in your government. And I see that the role of institutions and political leadership, or the lack of it, has been very crucial in this crisis. Like in the US, where public health is largely devolved, like incompetent national government contrasts with some of the active governors and mayors. And I see the same in Brazil, where we have a very complicated particular system that generates a lot of competition. But at the same time, I've been seeing mayors and governors really working together to tackle COVID response. And that's because they, at least in Brazil, they don't only have one really common enemy. They have two. They have to fight the federal government as well to do the right thing. And I think that here in the UK, what we see is a mounting evidence of like the national government's errors and failings. But what I see is that, and for me coming from Brazil, it's very weird. Some cities don't even have a mayor. So city leaders have far less policy autonomy to counterbalance that. So that is when the civil society and people need to really make pressure to have their needs assisted at this point.
Yeah. And then Andrés, Leanne mentioned green bonds, and I think one of the big challenges for local and city and regional leaders is actually raising funds. Particularly, you know, it's not, as you said before, the world is not equal, and the liquidity in the global north is not matched in the global south. What kind of solutions can city leaders look to, or what kind of approaches can they take actually to try and find the funding that they will need to do to make the sorts of differences that we're talking about here? Andrés, we can't hear you.
I am muted. There I am.
Thank you.
Now I'm muted myself. I was going to say that the world is going to get very creative here, because the needs for additional spending and infrastructure in the next 18 months during the crisis and after that are going to be gigantic. So let me begin with a very high level international and then come down to cities. In my mind, by far the most pressing issue in the world economy today, and I'm saying that not as an afterthought, but I've been thinking and writing about it, is the rich world today is swimming in liquidity. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan are printing currency like crazy, and interest rates are zero or negative. But countries like Brazil or like Turkey or like Indonesia or South Africa have a very hard time borrowing in international markets. And what public institutions like the World Bank or the development banks in the regions have to offer is, honest of God, tiny compared to the needs. When somebody says 25 billion, it sounds like a lot of money. But when you stop and think that rich countries are spending not billions, but trillions, when you think a country like Brazil has 210 million inhabitants, then those needs are gigantic and the sums available are really very small. And the ways of getting around that, I have an article coming out on Project Syndicate tomorrow on the subject, so I will not bore you with the technical details. Within countries, I think we're going to see a lot more borrowing by governments, and I think some of the challenge is for that money to percolate down to the local level. And the details of how that is done will depend crucially on the fiscal system in place in country. There are some countries where municipalities really live off transfers from the central government, Brazil being an example. There are other countries like the US where municipalities raise a lot of their own resources. As somebody who's lived in the UK for only 2 years, something that is very striking is how absurdly low property taxes are in the United Kingdom. I mean, council tax compared to property taxes in the US is absolutely nothing. I know many people in the UK complain because they think it's a lot of money, and when I get my bill at the end of the month, I don't like to pay it either. But I am pretty sure there's a fair bit of space for raising resources at the city level through a kind of taxation of property that is what you see in the rest of Europe, what you see in many parts of the world. And in this regard, I think the UK is lagging behind. Last but not least, there's the issue of, should cities borrow? And I have to say that the two hemispheres of my brain have mixed feelings on this. On the one hand, in my family, they make fun of me because they say I shouldn't have been an economist. I'm a frustrated architect and urban planner. So half of my head is thinking, yes, we want cities to be able to borrow. On the other hand, my first profession was an economic historian, and I know that all over the world, Latin America perhaps being especially the case, but not unique, when cities borrow, they often go belly up. And of course, in the US today, you look at counties in the US, cities in the US that have borrowed profusely. There are many, beginning with a huge Orange County in California today, which are essentially bankrupt. So yes, I am in favor of cities having some autonomy to borrow, but we need to build the safeguards, A, to make sure that the borrowing will be responsible, and B, to make sure the money will be used soundly. Mayors are elected officials, and elected officials all like pork barrel, big flashy projects before election time, many of which are not necessarily the kinds of things that people need. So more money coupled with better institutions to make sure that the money is well spent. I think that's the sort of formula we want to be thinking about.
Those flashy projects, Leanne, how can some of the other tools that city leaders have, and indeed that sometimes architects and city planners have, in terms of some of the commissioning approaches they may take, in terms of the design approaches they may take, how can that tackle both the risks, the fiscal risks, and also help to address the evening up and levelling up and getting the communities involved? Tell us about some of the techniques that are being used in London and other cities.
It's a really good question. I think in the UK in the last 10 years, we've worked really hard to try and make planning and placemaking more participatory, and not least with things like neighbourhood planning approaches that seek to put that decision-making role into local people's hands. I think my concern with those were originally about you're asking local people to do a skill that they don't necessarily possess in abundance, i.e. Placemaking is a skill and people have an opinion on it and can have some experience in it, but we need, as professionals, we need to be enabling local people to grow those skills. I think where I sort of come from is, how do we, as professionals, develop an approach that almost blends being professional and being a citizen, and helps those local people that have a role to play or want to play a role activate that, because we have to recognize that not everybody in a local area will want to get involved. So I think a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past 10 years has been about how to grow that confidence to participate, especially around young people. I think young people are often forgotten in the process, or are deemed hard to engage. But I think it means that we just need to think more differently, more creatively about how we do engage young people. And I think examples like the London Olympic Park, who took the step of creating a youth panel to help steer and guide decision-making on the park and ensure that young people have a voice. I think it's really important that going forward, and I think the pandemic has made this really, really clear, that not everybody has a right to the city. That is an idea that's been around for decades, but it's become incredibly apparent in the last few weeks just how exclusive elements of our city are, whether that's access to resources, access to healthcare, access to transport, access to jobs. So going forward, I think the challenge on us as professionals. Quite a lot of feedback. I do apologise. Our challenge as professionals going forward is how do we make the process more inclusive? Because I think as a process, we expect this process to deliver social outcomes, and I think if the process itself was more social, more socialized, as in more accessible, more inclusive, more reflective and responsive to people's needs, we get better places and more inclusive places as an outcome.
And I think some of the design, actually actively engaging people in design, not just on big projects, not just on big city thinking, but I think it does make quite a difference to outcomes, doesn't it? And in a conversation that we were having earlier in the week, Andrés and Elena, you both mentioned projects that you'd worked on. Elena, do you want to tell us something about yours? And I'd be interested afterwards in Andrés's experience in Chile.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's very interesting what Leanne is saying about making people part of the process. And I think that one way that we can do this, and thinking about the role of streets and roads and how are these flexible spaces can be, they can be sitting spaces for restaurants, they can be a larger pavements for people to walk and commute to work and on walking. Create cycle lanes, and we can all do this in a sort of like tactical urbanism, and using low cost temporary measures and do something now, but then go in adapting in the future. So this will allow as well the community and people to test, prove that this rearrangement of this space is working, and then give them feedback. And I think that the beauty about tactical urbanism is that, yes, it can be led by the government, but it also can be something that in my street with my neighbors, we decide to close the street and make signs and paint the road, and in a very playful way together we can transform transform this space.
And Andrés, in your time in government in Chile, you said that you had some experience. Oh, we seem to have Andrés appears to have frozen. So let's develop this a bit more while Andrés hopefully can come back into the discussion. I'm quite interested, particularly in how local urban spaces have the use of them has become much more intense over the past weeks and months. You know, as people had to practice social distancing. How do we capture some of the benefits of that? I mean, there's this thing of the Overton principle where you can make big dramatic decisions and bring forward decisions, which I know the Mayor of London is seeking to do in large swathes of the central and city of London, the central business district as well. How can we do more of that? This tactical urbanism. How can we seize the moment on what the pandemic has offered?
It's going to be really difficult, because I think we're naturally, as humans, we like to compartmentalize, we like to order, and we like to categorize. And I think cities are their own animal. They're almost beyond control. They kind of exist in a state of permanent, comfortable chaos. They're emergent systems. What you put in them doesn't necessarily, in terms of input, doesn't necessarily equal what comes out of them in terms of outputs. They're very complex and mysterious, and in many ways they're always acting and existing in a state of unknown and flux. And I think, speaking as a planner, I think our desire and our tendency is to try and put a grid on that and control, in order to put some kind of stability and stasis and solidity on that, whether it's a building or a system. And I think what the pandemic has shown us is actually we don't need to be afraid of mess. We don't need to be afraid of spontaneity. We don't need to be afraid of doing things differently, because great things can come as a result. Communities can come together. A great urban solution could pop out of that spontaneity. We don't have to have everything in neat boxes that have been evaluated to the nth degree. I'm not for 1 second saying we should chuck planning out the window. Far from it. I think it's about maybe about changing our kind of fundamental principles to see planning as a behavioural principle, in the same way that we had an epiphany about economics not always being about rational man, as in we don't always make rational decisions when it comes to economics, and behavioural economics shows that sometimes we make decisions that are from the outside completely bonkers, but they make sense to an internal logic, or they make sense to an internal narrative. And I think places and spaces in urban life, because they are effectively social, they start as social constructs. They are, cities by nature are social networks, that we need to appreciate that that planning as an approach needs to be also behavioural. How do we as planners and as urban professionals reconcile the idea that we're not just building stuff in space, that actually we are enabling urban life to take shape? We're here to help citizens, people, users of space create urban experience. And that, when you start to see it that way, you start to kind of decouple yourself from the sort of 3D functionality of space, and actually start looking at, well, what's the more philosophical, cultural and social dimension of urban space. And I think we have an opportunity to do that.
And Andrés, thank you for rejoining us.
Yes.
We came into this on the sort of discussion of the Overton principle. Can we seize the day here and make the most of some of the opportunities that the coronavirus pandemic has offered within cities? To what extent do you think that the economic challenge, the recession that's coming, the unemployment, to what extent, and also related to that, the fact that all governments are going to have to bring in more private finance if they're going to come up with solutions. The state, although states will be doing a lot of borrowing, it cannot only be public money that does it. To what extent do those two things, do you think, get in the way of what Leanne was talking about there, and Elena's point about community trust? What's the danger?
I think whenever things get thrown out the window and rearranged, and that will certainly be the case today, there are big opportunities, and we should seize those opportunities. We should not underestimate the complexity of what's ahead, however. Before we begin to think of how we can do better, we have to focus on not doing worse. I mean, many countries will have unemployment of 20% or more in the next 6 to 12 months. And as a result, the social and political tensions will be gigantic, and political systems under tension tend to make stupid decisions. And I think our main challenge will be to prevent political systems at the national level or international level or local level from making stupid decisions. Now, having said that, because there will be a great pressure to create jobs, and infrastructure investment provides those jobs, I think there's a natural connection between the two. And the big challenge there is to make sure that we invest in the right things, that we invest in things that are greener and leaner and cleaner than maybe traditional modes of thinking would have suggested. And it is there that the kinds of things that everybody on this panel is talking about are going to be key. The mobilization of civil society, the role of local layers of political decision making and not only national levels, the role of academics and experts and other people. I don't necessarily worry that much about the presence of private capital. Again, like most things in life, private capital can be brought in and it can do wonderful things or it can do terrible things. You know, I come from a country in which pretty much every road and every airport and every bus station is privately run. And I have to say that it's improved the lives of people massively. It used to take people 2 hours to get to the airport in Santiago, Chile. Today we have a highway that runs under the river, and travel times went from 2 hours to half an hour. On a good day, even 20 minutes. And so the reduction in pollution, the reduction in congestion, was absolutely gigantic. Now, that was a case of a public-private partnership that worked beautifully. I can also think of cases of private-public partnerships that have misfired tremendously. So the devil is in the details there. How do you arrange incentives? How do you exercise control over the initial design, over the quality of delivery? Who gets veto when over what? So, you know, people, I am not one of them, but I have colleagues who spend a lifetime looking at successful and unsuccessful examples of private financing of public infrastructure. And you can find the whole range. Countries and cities that have done very, very well and countries and cities that have done very, very poorly. So given that we have that experience and given that we have lessons from across the world, there's room to do it well. So it's not so much a lack of knowledge, it's basically the political will and the political skills to get it done properly that will be in most need.
And then those lessons from each other, that international learning. Elena, in your experience, how good are we at capturing that kind of international cooperation? What's some good examples, and what can we learn from and do better?
Great, Emma. Well, as working with international cooperation my whole life, I am a true believer in the power of network and collaboration. And even if countries won't do that in the international system, I think cities and regional governments are doing it properly. I want to cite some organizations who are doing a great work. The Global Resilient Cities Network, which is an initiative city-led that is continuing the work of 100 resilient cities. They have two very good initiatives. One is Cities in the Front Lines, or like a series of webinars where you put CROs, the Chief Resilient Officers from different cities, with experts talking and having this, having funders watching this can be very, very powerful. And the iteration and the way that cities who have been hit first by COVID are responding, and then they can bring some new learning from the cities that are now at the peak of the pandemic. They're also having a very interesting podcast series with the Resilience Shift, which is an initiative by Arab, an engineering international organization, but like here from the UK. About leadership and response. So it's weekly interviews with a series of leaders around the world on their response and recovery. And also, I just want to come back a little bit on the importance of the public space instead of buildings. And I think that our life will shift a lot to being outside. And I think maybe I'm very impacted by the amazing weather we've been having in the UK in the past months. And being a Brazilian, I've never seen that. But the truth is, the streets will be this new place where You can even have hotspots for children to have classes. It can be an extension of the school. It can be a place for social support. We can have pop-ups for like healthcare, health facilities like testing, for instance. We can have religious and cultural institutions come back to have our cultural gatherings in a more open space if we think about the streets. And the fact that City Lab did a very interesting initiative asking people all over the world to draw maps of their lives during lockdown. And these maps were basically the leafy streets and the parks. And there were barely no buildings in those maps because people are not living. I mean, being outside is being part of also the mental health of during this time of crisis. So as city and transportation leaders, I think their job is not to return to this inequitable, dangerous, unsustainable use of roads, and really see the streets as like open markets, as places for gathering with social distancing, really slow down the traffic, and also thinking about local neighborhood high streets and the buildings that we have in these streets that are, everybody lives a 5-10 minute walk from a high street, even if they don't live downtown. But there are so many places that could become co-working spaces so that they don't want to work at home. They can go to the space, but it's a 5-minute walk, it's a 10-minute walk from their home. So really, I invite you to rethink the street. And also want to mention this article, actually this report from the from the National Association of City Transportation Officials. It's just out of the oven. It was released 2 weeks ago. It's called Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. And it's a guide, it's a series of guidelines on how to use and redesign the streets through COVID. I think it can be very useful.
Thank you. In the last sort of 2 or 3 minutes before we actually take some questions that I think are coming in from people watching us today, can I ask each of you, maybe if we can start with you, Leanne, tell us what you think is the biggest threat from going into the unknown. What's the biggest threat, but also what's your biggest hope?
Wow. Okay. So my biggest hope is that, and actually writing right off what Helena's just said, is the hope is that we use this as an opportunity to rethink what our cities are for and how we shape them going forward. Our personal geographies are going to change. Our economic geographies are going to change. So this is the chance to make that change count, and perhaps do things differently, and not feel that we have to do things a certain way. My biggest fear is that we, and it alludes to what the question you posed earlier, which is that things like social value slide down the scale in favour of needing to prioritise economic drivers. In a nutshell. That is my fear, that we lose all of the valuable momentum and work that we put in. I don't think we will, but it is a fear of mine.
And Andrés, for you, what's your biggest fear and what's your biggest hope?
My biggest fear is that we continue to make a hash out of the response to the pandemic. And if we do badly, that will unleash two very toxic and dangerous forces. First of all, lasting unemployment with all the human suffering that brings. And as a result, nasty politics. If you look at human history, if you look at the history of the West over the last 100 years, periods of severe economic contraction followed by high unemployment has given us fascism, has given us world wars, has given us protectionism. And last time around, after the crisis a decade ago, it gave us Donald Trump. It is not hard to imagine a situation in which this crisis creates new divisions, in which the narrative that emerges from this crisis is we survived, but some people were lucky. because those academics and professionals and town planners can work from home and they keep getting a paycheck, and they're there for the new privileged class. And the people who work in a shopping mall or in a pizza parlor have not been able to work for months and they've lost their incomes. And those new social divisions help the very nasty populism in politics that we see in the US, that we see in Brazil, that we see in Turkey, that we see in the Philippines, in Mexico, and so many other places. My biggest hope is that out of the crisis, if we do things better, clearly there will be a lot of suffering, there will be a lot of people who will have a terrible time, but we know from our own histories that sometimes out of crises can come a renewed sense of social cohesion and of a joint and shared national and social purpose. Think of the UK after World War II. The fact that a rich kid from Oxford and a poor kid from the north of England had fought together. The fact that private businesses had been put to work for a common purpose, which was winning the war. The fact that the UK and the US, who had been part of the defeat of Nazism and fascism, created a sense of purpose, created a sense of a national project. It helped diminish, certainly not abolish, certain social and class inequalities in countries like the UK. And it gave us 30, 40 years of flourishing democracy. And as a result, we know that some crises end very badly and some crises can take the crisis and make it into an opportunity. Which one of the two it will be, I do not know, but I will confess that I often wake up at 3 a.m. fearing that this crisis may give us more Trumps and more Bolsonaros, and that's not something I'm looking forward to.
And Elena.
What can I add to this too? I mean, my biggest fear is that we come back to normal. I mean, we can come back to the way it was. And like Leanne said, my hope is that we take these resilience strategies, these climate action plans, and all these good ideas that are there already, and put them into action. And I don't know, Andrés, maybe you have a more clue of how to do it, but this is my hope. But definitely, please, no more Bolsonaros. Please.
Thank you, all three of you. I think we've got some questions coming in shortly. I'll just add my, I suppose my biggest fear is actually fear. That governments and populations will become so fearful that actually they can't think creatively and they can't get out there and participate. And that, I suppose, just looking at it from the current UK experience, that lockdown actually damages people's imaginations. I think that's one of the things that keeps me awake at night. But the great hope, I think, does lie in the potential for using it as a way to really take on the real challenge, which is climate change. And I think knowing that the statements that came out today from the finance ministers, the governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of France, and Mark Carney actually talking about needing to use a sustainable approach to finance. I think these are things that you could not have dreamed of happening even 2 or 3 years ago. And so to have the biggest challenge facing us really put into the spotlight, and seeing that some of the opportunities that we face in tackling the global pandemic could be put to the same use, and we might get a Green Deal, we might get more housing, we might get investment in infrastructure. That has to be the biggest hope of all, I think. So we'll see what the questions are from people coming in on the call, which I think is about to happen at any minute. So yes.
Well, yeah, thank you again to all of you for sharing all of those thoughts and taking the time to be with us. Yeah, we've really enjoyed that, and we've had a lot of discussion in the chat and people kind of sharing experiences from their cities, and how they think kind of their authorities are going to, and their communities, I guess, also are going to react to this situation. So something a couple of people have been asking in some way or another. So Diego in Santiago has been asking, Marley in London's been asking as well, is how can communities ensure, how I guess as a society collectively can we ensure that communities are directly involved in the decisions that we're making and that you know, the new opportunities that have been created out of this crisis, they filter down the system and aren't just monopolised by the ruling classes.
Who wants to have a go at that? How about you, Leanne?
That's a really interesting question. I think what we need right now is leadership on every level. We need national leadership, we need regional leadership, we need local leadership. Our local authorities are working really hard on very enormous challenges and pressures to not only deal with the COVID-19 response and the pandemic, but look forwards to what happens next with very little guidance as to how they're ever going to deliver services and manage local people's needs. So I think local people can do certain elements of active citizenship. So it could be getting involved in your local grassroots networks, whether it's about delivering informal services that we've seen that have emerged from the pandemic response, or people can get more, even more active and become part of their local leadership. They can get more involved in local politics at a grassroots level and really bring that community voice to the table. I think now more than ever, we need local democracy to be shouting loudly and making sure it's heard, because I think, speaking from my very personal point of view, I think at a national level, we've had a fundamental misread of the room, shall we say.
And Leanne, just to kind of to come off that point, so you mentioned about kind of things that people can do. How much of this do you think falls on citizens to be proactive? And actually, do you not think maybe we should be seeing more effort from our authorities to be the proactive ones that are reaching out to include citizens?
No, I don't. I think we need to take the initiative. I think we as citizens have a responsibility actually to make it absolutely clear what the changes that we want to see and be part of that change. We shouldn't rely on local authorities to interpret that, or our politicians to interpret that, or our politicians to speak for us. It's up to us as citizens in a democracy to use our voice that we have to its greatest potential and maximum potential.
Andrés, you're the one with the direct political experience. What do you make of those comments?
I think that our democracies are under challenge for many reasons. And one striking fact about today's world that is, if you ask people, how satisfied are you with the workings of the institutions of democracy in your country, is striking. Rich countries, poor countries, in the north, in the south, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, people are increasingly dissatisfied with the workings of democracy. That is not an argument for going the Bolsonaro route and speaking ill of democracy. On the contrary, that is an argument for injecting, a good dose of vitamins into democracy. And let me just leave you with one idea. We all talk about greater community participation, but anybody who's been to a big assembly in which people gave 2-hour speeches, you can know how frustrating that can be. Perhaps technology can help us in this regard. When social networks appeared a few years back, we were all very hopeful that Twitter and Facebook would be great for democracy. So far, I think they've been terrible for democracy. But why not, for instance, introduce more voting on local issues via my telephone, right? There's remarkably little voting at the local level. Cities take decisions that affect our daily lives. What are we going to do with this street or that building or this planning zone? In some countries, there's a lot of consultation at the local level. In many countries, there's very little. You wake up and there's a brand new highway outside your door. And nobody ever asked you about it. And technology could be our friend. So maybe one way, I'm not saying it's the only way, of injecting a little bit of enthusiasm and citizen participation is to combine that hunger for a different kind of democracy with technological change. Maybe there's an avenue there that we ought to explore, because otherwise I worry that many people, especially younger people, are going to become increasingly disappointed with democracy. And that's really no good. It is in nobody's interest that we travel that way.
Can I just complement what Leanne was saying, and I do agree that it is up to the citizens and they should claim this space. But sometimes it is just not easy, as Andrés was saying. Just let's make it easier, even with technology. But coming where I come from, maybe we should also think about how the government can leverage these community leaders, religious leaders, people who are doing some sort of charity work. They know what's going on in the very in the favelas, in the communities. So working with these leaders at the very local community level can be, and then implementing the technology or creating an app. There are several cities who have like this como vamos, like how are we doing on this and that, to understand how their policies are perceived is very important. Mix this too, because I think nothing substitutes like the people.
There is one question here that is in between a comment and a question. Male is wondering if this crisis would allow cities, well, different tiers of government to take action with racism, diversity and inclusion. What do you think?
Andrés, do you want to start on that one?
Well, clearly we all know where that question is coming from, and I think at a gathering like this one cannot simply by say how outrageous and how painful things we've been seeing around the world, particularly in the US, are. They simply remind us what a long way it is that we still have to travel before, even in rich and advanced societies, we can be satisfied with degrees of respect and equality that we enjoy. And that if that is true in countries like the US and the UK, where the road is still very long, in countries like Brazil or Chile, where I come from, the road is even longer. And the extent of discrimination is still more painful. Now, one of the domains of discrimination, which is particularly painful, is simply urban. When I was in government in Chile, I commissioned a study in which we asked how many square meters of parkland, of greenery per inhabitant did we have in the different municipalities of the city of Santiago. Santiago is a big city. It has nearly 8 million people, 7.5 million people. Chile, central Chile is fairly dry, so you need to water a piece of land a lot to get something green to grow on it. And you will not be surprised to hear that square meters per inhabitant were hugely unequally distributed. If you lived in a posh part of town, there are parks everywhere. If you lived in a not so posh part of town, you'd have to walk for miles before you could, hit a little plaza with a little, green tree and a bit of lawn. And as a result, racial and social inequalities get compounded by urban inequalities. I'm an optimist in this respect. First of all, I think there's growing awareness that this is unsustainable. Secondly, big plans of certain kinds of infrastructure can make a big difference. In Brazil and in Chile, for instance, the construction of subway systems have managed to integrate the city and bring public services to poor parts of town that, where change can come not over decades, but over a few years. But a lot remains. And let me go back in closing to the theme of my initial remarks. Because jobs will be so scarce in the next few years, and because governments will be eager to invest to create those jobs, there is a huge opportunity. And I think it is up to the political process, to local leaders, to cities, to make sure that that infrastructure is green, is clean, and it goes to the right parts of town and not to the wrong parts of town. And that's a very effective and very fast way of redressing some of these inequalities. And I think it can be done.
Elena, Leanne, do you want to add to that?
I'd like to, I think this question comes back as well, like I started. It comes back to, if you don't address the chronic stresses of your city, of your society, inequality, racism, unemployment, youth disenfranchisement, and several others, there is no way that you will be prepared to fight a disaster, a pandemic, a crisis like the one we are. And I think that what coronavirus has done is like even like staying at home, and like the way that people in more vulnerable communities have been hit so much harder shows that enough, like we have to address these questions before that we can have the strength to fight a crisis like this one. And I am optimistic as well. I think it's we cannot come back to normal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's patently clear that communities certainly are under stress constantly from inequality and just the lack of the right to the city. It's sort of alluding to a message that or an idea that we were talking about earlier, and the sense that the city is almost like a membership with certain perks afforded to some members of our community and certainly excluded to others. We cannot have cities acting and behaving in this way, or cities creating cities to act and behave in this way. The city is for all of us. And the fact that the COVID-19 has shone a spotlight on it shows that actually we've been blind to the stresses and chronic stresses and chronic inequality that is faced by communities on a day-to-day basis. They have shown the most incredible level of resilience on a day-to-day basis, and where we have to act on that. We cannot unsee that. We have to recognise that the city is something that we've constructed, and that we build that in, and we need to take it out. We need to unpick that and make sure that going forward it isn't that when we produce urban space going forward, that we don't build that in again.
Can I add something which I meant to before, but I forgot? In many cities in the developing world, one big source of inequality is travel time to work. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, people can take 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening to go to work and from work. The good news is that by vastly improving infrastructure, particularly subways, you can alleviate that. The bad news, and we should be honest about this, is that the job of public transport systems will be much more difficult because of social distancing. And if that's over in 6 months, well, we can get over the hump in 6 months. But it could well be that because of issues of public health plus changing commuter habits, public transport will become more problematic going forward. So that big equalizing tool that we've had will be somewhat less helpful. And the question is, what can we do? And let me give you one idea. For the last couple of decades, we have focused on getting people to where the jobs are. Perhaps we should begin to think about getting jobs to where people are. And in big cities like London, like Sao Paulo, like so many others, that can make all the difference in the world. Now, there are some jobs that travel very easily and some that do not. But again, I think the fact that we've learned that we can work from home, not all jobs can be taken home, but many middle-class people, many working-class people are traveling 2 hours to go to an office and sit in front of a computer screen. Perhaps some of that can be done from home. The issue of services, Elena said earlier that something striking that strikes you immediately when you come to London is that everybody is within 5 blocks of a high street. That's not true in Sao Paulo, Brazil. You have to, get on a bus or get on the subway or walk 5 kilometers to come to a supermarket. So the fact that we can, in fact, in many cities in the world, particularly in the developing world, change those urban structures so that there are more services at the local level. And of course, those services provide jobs, so that if you're going to be packing bags in a supermarket, you can do that at least 5 blocks away from your house, as opposed to 2 hours away from your house. So there are many changes in the pattern of production and employment that can make urban structures much more livable. And I think there's a lot of room for innovation there. And maybe the pandemic has put those issues right in the middle of the debate, and we should take advantage of that.
That's a very interesting point.
That's a very, very interesting point, Andrés. Unfortunately, we're running over time. I feel that we could keep on having this discussion for hours, because it's a really interesting topic. But I want to thank you all for being part of this panel. And I would like to remind everyone that this video will remain in YouTube, so you can revisit it and review it. Luke, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to second that. Thanks. I think we've been very privileged to spend the evening with all the, these very knowledgeable speakers, and it's been a great conversation. So thank you to all of you taking part. Thank you to everyone around the world that's been watching online as well. And yeah, we're back next week with some artist talks live from the Mass virtual gallery space. Hope to see you there. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye. It was a pleasure.
You can keep